Alex was wearing his Breathe If You're Horny trucker cap. It must have been a Wednesday. He'd always wear that hat on Wednesday while making lewd references to Hump Day. As a regular at Mac's Pub, I had grown accustomed to the quirks and eccentricities presented by some of the regulars. Alex was a local janitor that spent his downtime hitting on every woman in the bar and making overt masculine gestures. More often than not, he could be found in the men's room as the eager mouth on the other side of the glory hole. If anyone else had noticed this, they didn't say a word. On this particular evening, Alex was sitting at the table across from Emma. To all outward appearances, Emma was a quiet office worker who sat alone drinking wine. He was halfway through a pickup line that involved a reference to his penis and Dale Earnhardt when Christy slid into the chair next to him. Christy and Emma weren't a couple so much as they were friends that occasionally had sex. Alex had been trying to wriggle his way between them for months. If he'd had any luck with that, he'd been in for a rude awakening. I supplement my income by working as a freelance web designer. Basically, if you have a small business and you want a basic website with easy maintenance, I'll hook you up for a few $100. Emma is one of my customers. I'm not supposed to tell anyone, but she's known online as Mistress Spanks. Christy, her friend and sometimes playmate, is her sub. The two of them supplement their income with a moderately successful lesbian bondage site. Every time Alex flirts with her, I can't help but wonder if he knows that she wears a leather corset under that white blouse of hers. I was sitting at the bar that night. I had received a text from a woman who called herself Wednesday. It was offering me $1,000 for some freelance work. I was to meet my contact at the bar. That approached me with the word Rosebud. It was a bit more cloak and dagger than I was used to, but for $1,000, I'd let Mistress Spanks hit me with a paddle as I busted a load all over Alex's trucker cap. It was around this time that Max started tugging on my jacket. He wasn't a dwarf, but you wouldn't know unless he told you. He stood just over 5 foot tall. His head was either shaven or bald. What facial hair he had was peppered with gray. He looked like a child wearing a fake beard. In a voice that was far too high-pitched to take seriously, he said,
"Hey, fucker, what's the money you owe me?"
I reached into my pocket and pulled out a wad of 10s and 5s before passing a few of them to my diminutive friend. I'd mistakenly bet a few bucks that he couldn't get Chrissy to give him a lap dance in front of everyone. I failed. After watching him try to climb onto his bar stool for a few seconds, I picked him up by his belt and put him onto his seat. He smirked and said,
"You bet me $20. I offered her 15."
I laughed and said, "You cheeky dickwaffle." Gonzo handed him a beer, and we toasted to his wit and victory. It was roughly halfway through the evening when a woman whispered the word Rosebud into my ear. I turned around to see a skinny girl with black pigtails draped over a pale face, handed me an iPad with Emma's website pulled up. I quickly pressed the home button and said, "So are you wanting me to build you something similar?" The woman's expression did not change. Instead, she pulled a Jarm clove cigarette from her bra and lit it with a light she'd pulled from God knows where. After a long drag, she blew smoke in my face and said, "I want you to build me a website like that one. $1,000 for the site, another 1,000 if you'll help set up the video production." I smirked and replied, "It isn't outside my skill set. You have a name to go with that pretty face?" Her dry expression shifted to a hint of a smile as she said, "My name is Rona, but for the purposes of this venture, call me Wednesday." I turned to Max and said, "I need your seat, buddy." Max turned towards Rona and smiled before hopping off his stool. He sauntered back to the men's room. Miss Wednesday slid into the seat next to me, and we began to work out the details of her new internet venture. After pricing cameras, lighting equipment, and web hosting, we opted to spend the rest of the evening drinking and getting to know each other. Wednesday lived in one of the fancier dormitories of a nearby Catholic university. I had been hired to set up several cameras in her dorm room. With this setup, she'd make videos and chat with would-be customers. It wasn't terribly difficult to set up. I could have most of it up in under a week. Aside from cashing in on the lucrative market of schoolgirl pornography, Wednesday was an honors student with the intention of attending Dartmouth for graduate studies. We were about 3 mugs into our second pitcher of PBR when I slammed into the bar and lost consciousness for a few moments. The room was hazy as I stumbled to my feet. Tinnitus had set in. My ears were ringing to the point that I couldn't hear myself shouting. The room had been decimated by something outside. The windows had blown inward. As my eyes came into focus, I couldn't help but notice that Emma sat far too still for my comfort. She seemed fine at first, however, As I moved closer to her, I could see that her left side had been reduced to hamburger meat and visible shards of bone. Likewise, Christy had been thoroughly shredded by debris. I winced in pain as I stepped closer to the window. The ringing in my ears was starting to subside. I brought my hand to the back of my head and pulled it away when I felt a warm ooze moving through my coarse hair. I was bleeding. Several cars in the parking lot had caught fire. If that had been the cause of the explosion, there was no way to tell. The black smoke filled the parking lot and made it very difficult to see much further than the edge of the road. I turned my attention inside and took inventory of the carnage in the bar. Aside from Emma and Christy, several other patrons were shredded to pieces. Had I not been sitting where I was, I probably would have died in the blast. Wednesday had not been so lucky. Her exposed spinal column oozed with blood and viscera as she lay slumped over the bar. I moved toward the men's room to get a look at myself in the mirror. The hallway was littered with debris, but seemed fine. Max moaned in his high-pitched voice as Alex made garbled sounds akin to the Cookie Monster deep-throating a Polish sausage. I don't suppose I was terribly surprised that those two were still going at it, but I was a little distracted by the blood seeping from my ears and head. I washed up as best I could in the sink and wrapped a brown roll of paper towels around the back of my head before tucking it in on the end. As I moved back into the main room of the pub, I suddenly had the presence of mind to check my phone. I dialed emergency services, but the number was busy. I cursed aloud before trying again.
Fuck.
Busy.
Shit.
There was a sudden movement out of the corner of my eye. I jerked my gaze toward the movement, but I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. All of a sudden, I saw something whiz past my peripheral vision. I went cross-eyed for a moment, trying to focus on the wisps of black smoke that were moving past me just fast enough to be almost imperceptible. This tornado of activity swirled around me to the point that I started to scream. Then it stopped. The crackle of fire outside of the window was the only sound that remained in the still room. I stepped behind the bar to find Gonzo curled up on the floor. He wasn't moving. From what I could tell, he had a shard of metal protruding from his face. The mirror had shattered, but the metal behind it was intact. I pushed on it to reveal a hidden cupboard. Several of the bottles had shattered, but a bottle of Johnny Walker Black had survived. I pulled it out and placed it on the bar. It was around this time that a man in a pinstripe suit walked into the room. He moved through the carnage and debris as if it were any other day. He positioned himself next to Wednesday in my old seat and said, "Mind pouring me a glass of the good stuff? Been so long since I had a decent glass of scotch." I nodded and reached for the first glass that didn't appear to be completely shattered. I poured him 3 fingers and slid it over to him. I took a pull from the bottle and chugged a little longer than I should have. The smooth burn of scotch helped distract me from the man in front of me. He killed the liquor in front of him and motioned for me to pour him another. He spoke up, saying, "I wasn't expecting you to be moving around. Certainly puts a damper on things." He pulled out a leather-bound ledger and thumbed through several pages before stopping on a tarnished sheet of paper. I couldn't help but look down. The page contained far more information than should have fit on the page. It was less like looking at a page and more like staring into a window that displayed a library of information. His brow furrowed. He grabbed Miss Wednesday by the wrist and dropped it as he cursed under his breath. His gaze shifted to the young waitress on the floor next to him. She was on her back. Her red hair and pale skin seemed like they'd be prettier if they hadn't been rearranged like an abstract painting. Her name tag read, Lizzie. The man cursed some more and said, "Okay, so it seems there's been a bit of a foul-up. Mind helping me out?" He leaned in and said a few words into my ear. A woman whispered the word rosebud into my ear. I must have dozed off. Startled, I turned around to see a skinny girl with black pigtails draped over a pale face. She held an iPad in her hands. I turned to her with a smile and said, "Miss Wednesday, why don't we take this conversation somewhere a bit more secluded?" Her dry expression shifted to a smile as she replied, "I love a man who does his homework." I smirked and said, "I'm sure you do, Miss Rona." A waitress fluttered past us, and I reached out and tapped her on the shoulder. She turned toward me, and I said, "My lady friend and I are heading down to Mr. J's. Want to blow this shithole and join us?" Moments later, we were in the parking lot and walking toward the street. A man in a pinstripe suit passed us on the sidewalk. Just as he tipped his hat, a flatbed truck pulled around the corner and blew past us. I turned to watch as it accelerated toward the next turn. The driver must not have cut the wheel too hard because the truck smashed into a truck parked in Mac's parking lot. The 800-gallon propane tank separated from the straps holding it and smashed into the parking lot. It slid across the concrete in a shower of sparks before exploding in a terrible fashion. A cold chill went down my spine. I turned towards the man in the pinstripe suit and instinctively grabbed the back of my head. My coarse hair was dry, and this left me unsettled as violent scenes flooded through my mind. The girls were still crouched down and cowering as the man said, "Thanks. Oh, and you might want to quit smoking." I turned toward Miss Wednesday and Lizzie the waitress. I helped them to their feet, and after some panicked conversation and a call to emergency services, we ended up going back to my place. While reading the news later that night, I'd read that only 2 survivors of that tragic accident that occurred at Mac's pub that day were local residents Max Kirk and Alex Nelson. I've tried to make sense of it all, but frankly, I can't even begin to tell you the why or the how. One thing sticks with me, though. When the man was thumbing through his leather-bound journal, several of the pages ended with the same date. November 11th, 2017.